Well, good morning, and thank you very much, Esko, for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at Sitra. As Esko said, Sitra and Nesta have, well, certainly Nesta has learned an awful lot from the success of Sitra in the past, and it's a great privilege to be here to be introducing the first session, and I'll be talking some more about that in a second. Nesta is the UK's largest endowment focused on transforming the UK's capacity for innovation, and if I explain to you a little about what we do, we run a venture capital fund, so we invest directly in projects. We also run programs designed to inspire a culture of innovation in the UK, and we conduct research and policy and use that to advise the government on the development of innovation policy in the UK, and that's specifically my area. It's also good to be here and working with IISS and Dr. Cronin, who is a mentor of mine in Washington, and it's good to be working with him again. So it's all around a great experience. Thank you very much. User-inspired innovation is the title of the first session, which I will be introducing. This was a topic that most of you will have heard of, which was investigated and popularized by Erich von Hippel, largely, in the late 1980s, particularly through his work at MIT, the work on the sources of innovation and democratizing innovation. Since then, it's been developed by a relatively small cadre of leading thinkers and practitioners, two of whom we have with us today to share their latest thoughts on the subject. My job in introducing the topic is to set the scene, to introduce it, to introduce the speakers, and then to get out of the way and let the discussion commence. My main objective in introducing user-inspired innovation is to show that it's not a crazy idea that takes innovation away from manufacturers and what we understand to be the production of science and the production of new technologies, but it's a serious subject that deserves real study and needs attention from companies and particularly policymakers who frankly have been quite lax in understanding what it really means for innovation policy around the world. What is user-inspired innovation? Well, I'll give you a caricature of what it is. Traditional manufactured-centered innovation is manufacturers identifying user needs, developing products at private expense, and then profiting by protecting those products and essentially selling them to consumers. The user-centered innovation paradigm is lead users develop their own needs at private expense and then tend to freely reveal those in the future. They don't always freely reveal them, but they tend to. These products and services which have been developed by users may then be developed by manufacturers later on, and I'll get onto that later on. Somewhere in between these two concepts is something called sort of heavy user engagement, extensive market research. This is where you learn an awful lot about your market before you develop products, which might seem to be common sense, but seems to be something that is recently being seen to be important in innovation. So, for instance, IBM's Living Labs would be an example of this, which is user-centered but not user-led. The basic principle of user-centered innovation is represented by this graph. The principle is that users are frequently the earliest innovators and some of the most advanced. They quite often take on the most difficult tasks, essentially identifying what to innovate, the question, what do I need, rather than how do I best produce and refine what I need, which is the question most often taken on by manufacturers later on. So you have users innovating at the front end, you then have manufacturers producing and iterating products later on, and this is the way in which the graph progresses. In certain fields, users are by far the most innovative part of the supply chain. If you have manufacturers, suppliers, and users, in certain fields, not all, users are by far the most innovative. For instance, scientific instruments, this is a study led by Erich von Hippel, which demonstrates that 77% of the most commercial innovations in scientific instruments were originally developed by users. And this is replicated in a number of other areas. Medical instruments is a classical area where surgeons develop, invent, and adapt their own products, which are then taken up by manufacturers. And This has been replicated, this study has been replicated in many other areas. Pipe hanger hardware, for instance, printed circuit boards, and crucially extreme sports equipment. So right from industry-focused innovations right through to consumer-focused innovations. Some examples of medical developments that were innovated by users originally are these two here. Of course, they've been refined by manufacturers, but the original inventive step was not taken by a manufacturer, but by users who were actually had the necessity to develop these inventions for furthering their professional ambitions. And finally, users may also develop lots of consumer market innovations as well, and these are some of the most obvious. Mountain biking, as most of you probably know, was essentially invented in Marin County in Northern California by Gary Fisher and people like that, who were just customizing bikes because they wanted to go downhill at high speeds and normal bikes fell apart. So they built their own. These were then developed by companies like Marin, like Kona, and developed into an entirely new industry. This is going on again in mountain biking in Utah and on the north shore of Washington State with extreme downhill mountain biking, with users innovating and manufacturers following. The other classic example is surfboards. The entire sport of surfing was essentially enabled by the development of certain types of foot straps and materials that were then developed by users but then adopted by manufacturers and enabled the sport of windsurfing to develop. Slightly more detailed case study is the case of Lego Mindstorms. Lego has put users at the center of its innovation process. This is not in the obvious way that Lego does, because of course in Lego you have to make your own product. That's the point. It's not that. With something like Mindstorms, they've actually allowed users to develop their own components and to develop and share them and sell them to each other through communities. So they essentially provide a kit. The instructions are only a small part of that kit. What people are actually doing is developing their own products and their own processes and then selling them to each other. You can see this graph here that without company involvement, the Lego Mindstorms user communities developed precipitously from the introduction of the Lego Mindstorms kits. And this is the kind of essentially, in this role, the manufacturer was just the facilitator of this takeoff, although, of course, they then benefited enormously from it later on. What Lego has chosen to do is take advantage of this by essentially linking up with what are called lead users, those people who are ahead of the market, who foreshadow the general demand that is likely to come later on. And they've done this in two interesting ways. One is they've integrated what's called adult fans of Lego, people who are sort of advanced users but not children, into their research and development process to develop new products. So users are actually involved in Lego's development of new products. The second one is Lego Factory, which allows people to develop their own new types based on Mindstorms, to share them and then to buy and sell them through a website which has been provided by Lego. There's a question here as to who is the user, and this is fundamental to the understanding of what user-centered innovation is all about. We can all be users and manufacturers and suppliers at the same time. Boeing is a manufacturer of airplanes, but a consumer, a user of machine tools. In a similar way, surgeons, as you would think of them as sort of suppliers of medical services to you, they're actually consumers and users of medical instruments. So we have to think in a functional definition as to where people sit in terms of innovation. Are they users or suppliers or manufacturers? And quite often you can be all three in different parts. For instance, there are pipelines that have largely been innovated, new types of pipeline and pipeline management systems that have largely been developed by suppliers, not by manufacturers or by users, but by suppliers. And the way in which you identify who is going to be most important is the person who's going to most benefit from the development of the invention. You can do this in quite a strong economic way. So why do users innovate? Well, first of all, they have an informational advantage. Knowledge of user needs is scarce, and users know what they want. They know it better than anybody else, and therefore they are in a position where they can innovate. The next stage, of course, is that quite often users, and this is where you'll see user innovation most, is when users have the highest benefit from their own invention. you'll see that users can quite often appropriate the benefits of innovation through trade secrecy in a way that manufacturers cannot. So particularly with things like processes, you will see users innovating processes because they can protect them behind factory walls, whereas the manufacturers can't really do that, and there's no intellectual property that will enable them to protect that. So you will see that they can appropriate the benefits, and therefore the incentives to them to innovate are much higher. Fundamentally, the user can innovate only for themselves, whereas if a manufacturer is going to innovate, they need to demonstrate as part of their business plan that that can meet a lot of user needs. It needs to be general, whereas users can innovate just for themselves. They only need to satisfy, they've got a consumer market of one, which is themselves, and then they can see whether it's important to other people. They also are quite often not developing these to sell, and also their costs of innovation tend to be lower. They maybe aren't looking to roll this out and therefore have to meet all of the regulatory obligations that go with developing manufactured products, and also because they have the information, they don't have to spend a huge amount of time in developing the research and the knowledge required to develop the correct types of innovation. This does not mean that the manufacturer has no role to play, even in these particular areas where users are in the lead in terms of developing new products. They can link to lead users. These are people who foreshadow general demand in the marketplace and can therefore signpost development. And they also normally expect to obtain high benefit, as I was saying before. Few examples are Suunto, the watch manufacturers have done this very well, and a number of other organizations around the world. Of course, however, as a company, you can never know whether someone is a lead user or just an early user. They could have needs that are only relevant to themselves, and actually therefore not be a lead user, but essentially you'll be developing one product for one consumer, and you have to be careful for that. So as I wrap this up and begin the introductions, the critical questions, I think, in terms of thinking about user-inspired innovation is: in what industries is user-led innovation important? In what areas are manufacturers and suppliers important, and where are users important? How can policy support user-led innovation? And we tend to be very much lagging in this regard. And what implications does this have for intellectual property? If users are going to be released in order to innovate in the way in which we would like them to, if they're going to develop some of these most advanced products, what does an intellectual property regime really need to look like? As I said, we're very privileged today to have two leading thinkers on user-inspired innovation to make a couple of presentations, and then two comments. I'll do the introductions first of all, and then I'll just make very small introductions at the beginning of each person's presentation. First of all, we have Mika Pantsar, who's the head of research at the National Consumer Centre of Finland. He's an economist and research professor in National Consumer Research Centre in Helsinki, and he's published scientific articles within consumer research, design and technology studies, the rhetoric of economic policy, food studies, systems research and future studies. I've read a number of his works, and they've been very influential, particularly the domestication of technology. And he's currently working on a book entitled The Choreography of Everyday Life Towards an Integrative Theory of Practice. He'll be talking to us today about who makes sport, promoters and practitioners dialogue, and he'll be the first presenter in a few minutes. We then move on to Charles Leadbeater, who's been very influential in the development of my own thinking around innovation. He's a world-renowned expert on innovation and an author on the subject, both in terms of writing books, but also in a kind of more accessible style and popularizing the subject of innovation. His most recent work, which is due to be published this year, is We Think, the Power of Mass Creativity, which I think will form the inspiration for the majority of his talk today. He was profiled in the New York Times in 2004 for generating one of the best ideas of the year, which is linked directly to user-inspired innovation, which is the rise of the activist amateur, outlined in his report, The Pro-Am Revolution, which is very good reading indeed. I recommend it to you all if you want to get into this subject. We're very privileged at Nesta to work with Charles in his capacity as a senior fellow at Nesta, but he's also a long-standing member and associate of Demos, the think tank in London, and a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford's Said Business School. And he will be making the second presentation on We Think, the process and importance of collaborative creativity. We then have 2 expert comments. First of all, from Mr. Petri Peltonen, the Director General of the Technology Department in the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Previously spent his career in Tekes and also a stint at the European Space Agency. The second comment that we have is from Dr. Sirkka Heinonen, who is Chief Research Scientist at the Technical Research Centre of Finland, VTT, and works largely on the philosophy of technology, future studies, technology and technology foresight. She's also a member of the Club of Rome. So without further ado, that is my introduction over, and I'd very much like to hand over now to Mika Pantsar for his presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It's really a privilege to position to discuss with Richard and Charles, because I know quite a lot about their work also. So it's I think we are quite in the same field. My presentation deals actually with 3 themes, which I think we can see in historical terms what has happened in the way we see innovations and consumers, their relationships. First of all, it was up to 80s very much what dominating view was the kind of receiver's view, where the technological and commercial determinism dominated. It meant that consumers were only adapting and taking innovations as they are. And then the second stage, which I call consumer elite view, it started very much from the 1980s when Erik von Hippel started his studies about lead users. And why I say that it's elite view, it's very much because it's so much influenced by the idea that there is lead users. There is some very special consumers who are much better, much more educated people, and typically these lead users, they are young, wealthy men. And actually, his technology history tells that typically in many innovations, young, wealthy men have been the first movers in innovations. But I think that in future and now we are understanding more that there is the creativity, it's the mass creativity, as Charles is going to tell later on, that there's ordinary people are also involved in innovativeness and creativity, and their creativity of everyday life is important part. Also, it seems that this lead user analysis, all these things, they have been very much focusing on kind of productive functions of consumption. Those very areas like agriculture, serious leisure, but not so much about casual leisure, passive leisure, and understanding about our ordinary life. It has not been the strength of that approach. And now I think partly because of Web 2.0, but also for political reasons, we are going now toward new idea which I have called social movement view, that it is practitioners, consumers themselves who make the movement, and especially this Web 2.0 new technologies is making this sharing possible. It's, for instance, this Lego example is kind of example for that. So my main claim in this presentation it is that practitioners always are in the main role, also in other areas than in serious leisure. First, some slides from history. In Finland, it has been very much that innovations has coming from other countries, and especially after Second World War time, Finland was the most Americanized country in importing different ideas, especially about future of sport. For instance, in 1960s there was an article which said that in future everybody are doing this water skiing. Or also this kind of idea from America, it was very important. It was already in 1933 Chicago World Fair. This was this kind of said in this World Fair that science finds, industry applies, man conforms. This was the main idea in the 20th century technology. And truly, if one reads Finnish papers, media, for instance, it has been, America has been very much model, for instance, how electronics changes kitchen. This was pictures from 1923. Also, these many fairs came to Helsinki. This is 1961. This fair, which then moved to Moscow. It was in Helsinki, and in that fair they introduced for Finnish people, for instance, American bowling. And it's interesting that actually many sports have been imported from America. Baseball in 1930s, basketball in 50s, bowling 50s, American football in 70s. And this is very much this kind of receiver's point of view. But what I'm going to suggest that actually always when we are importing some sport or anything in our everyday life, we are always reinventing and localizing sport, and it is the role of practitioner which is important. I have now some slides from a book which was published in 1928, and it was made by Finnish sport philosopher Tahko Pihkala, and he was telling Finnish people what are the good sport for Finland. And actually he imported American baseball, and then they have this R&D seminars in one sport institute where they in a way made this sport for Finnish audience super proper, and now we know the pesäpallo, which is kind of variant of American baseball. But this is the science and technology studies, these terms translating, configuring, they were important part of that. Also, Tahko Pihkala tell that camping is the future. He told about America, how the camping has changed the whole leisure time of America, and then there's all kinds of inventions where, for instance, car had this kind of special system when you are making some food in your car, you need to be innovative there. Nowadays the cars are a bit different in America, but still cars are important. Another sport he introduced for Finns was golf, but he said that Finland is really too poor country for this great sport. There were several pages he was telling about golf, and actually golf in America is very much in Los Angeles. It's golf and cars are now very much related to each other. But what was interesting in his book was that he made the vocabulary of golf in his book. He gave names for different clubs and sticks, and it was really, they have not been coming part of vocabulary in golf because it took 50 years before golf actually came into Finland. Now my main story or my main example, it's Nordic walking. How walking sticks were reinvented in about, actually it is almost 10 years ago. There was one seminar where those people from one company, Excel, which is the main manufacturer of these Nordic walking sticks, and then Vierumäki Sport Institute and Suomen Latu, which is kind of outdoor organization, they in a way decided to start this movement, and now I'm going to tell something about that because it's really kind of about mass creativity. First of all, the context in Finland, it was very suitable for this kind of invention because in statistical research made in different countries, it seems that Finland is very special in its sport activity. Everybody's always very seriously and outdoor. It's really strange that, for instance, in Finland there is less than in any other country people who say that I'm not a sporty type. So we don't recognize this kind of non-sporty type so well as in many other countries. And in time use studies you can see that Finns are doing a lot sports in their life, but especially it's outdoor. 90% of Finnish people say that their main hobby is walking outdoor near their home. So it's walking was the main hobby, and it's very understandable that then when this marching started, this Nordic walking started, it started in Finland. It was, I don't know what is the term in English, but in Finnish we said that tuulipukukansa, which means this kind of ordinary people with their special suits on. but then very soon it went to other countries, and it was already booming in the beginning of new millennium in Germany. But still, 1 year before this, when this was introduced in this sport in München sport exhibition, everybody were laughing at. But in 1 year it changes totally, and nowadays when Excel is introducing anything in sport exhibitions, it's all the big manufacturers are willing to be part of that movement. Then it went to, especially in Central Europe, it was very, very well. In Switzerland, there was a newspaper that they had some problem that it's about Nordic walkers annoying the cows. This was really, really a big problem. But also in Finland, in the beginning, in Helsinki Sanomat newspaper, there was many stories how the roads or paths are destroyed by these stupid people who are using these sticks. Norway, Finns introduced 2 sticks in skiing in the 19th century for Norwegian people, and now they have introduced this Nordic walking in Norway, and now it's quite popular there. But in every country this is quite different sport. For instance, in France it's part of these parks and life, and especially in United States this is real challenge for the company, because in United States they have different kinds of fitness sports already. For instance, power walking, fitness walking, pole striding, exercise striding, and what is important in America, it's belly button and thighs. It's about kind of shape of our body. It's not about anything so much about going outside and having good time, but shaping your body. It's important in America. And now if you're going, for instance, South Beach in Florida, you can see these people shaping their bodies there. Then Excel started to export these Nordic sticks to China also. They were big promises. They have good connections to sport minister and all these things, but I don't know how well it has actually happened. But what is actually the problem of the company, Excel company, in the beginning? It was how to redo walking, how to rethink walking, how to rematerialize walking. These were the kind of innovation problems for the company in 1996 when they started to think about this in the company and trying to find partners. And actually it has been a really interesting innovation, because technically it has been very, very simple. It has been more about conceptual innovations, and the population of active Nordic walkers nowadays in world, it's about 8 million people all over the world. And contrary to many other sports, it is that anybody who has tried it once, they keep on having that training session with these sticks, so they have, it is not a fad or fashion, but it's something more permanent. And then was in the beginning, Esko asked what is innovation, and I think that still Joseph Schumpeter's idea that innovation, it's about integrating. I think it's a very good idea that entrepreneur combines, relates, integrates and organizes pre-existing but previously separate components in novel way. And we can think that Excel was actually doing very much this, that these components, elements were there, but they were just good enough to reconfigure these elements in one part, and then they said that actually they were very skillful, or they think that they were very skillful in some strategy seminar. When they were inventing this word Nordic, they said that there was a conscious aim in the use of the word Nordic to associate walking with Nordic freshness, pure nature and healthy lifestyle. And I think that this innovation is very much associating. It's associating not only these different concepts, but also different material aspects, different skills together and make the innovation to work. And indeed, the history of this company, it has been very successful in different fields, for instance, in alpine skiing, poles, and also it is really related to two things. First of all, they have technology, composite technology, which is physics, it's chemistry. And then they have interest in sport, and in a way they have in that company they have introduced these two parts together, and for instance in floorball, Excel has been very, very influential. But then is it really so that companies could make historical conditions of their own success? Wasn't it actually so that historically Finland was there and we have this special idea what is walking, what is going outdoors? So it was Excel just should take this as given. And then another question, to what extent business could influence the ways ideas, material objects, skills are integrated in practice? Were they skillful enough to decide how consumers themselves integrate these different parts in together? And then finally, what is the role of practitioners in the reproduction of the practice, making the practice all the time lively? And actually, when we are going further and more carefully studying what has happened in Nordic walking, there has been a lot resistance. In the beginning, there was a lot resistance in the factory, in the Excel company. Retail is always the most conservative when anything new is introduced. I think that very often we think that consumers are conservative, but at least in sport area, it is always the sport outlets which are the most conservative. Also in press there everybody were laughing at and also consumers, especially people like me who don't do this Nordic walking. We think very easily that this is stupid looking kind of thing, and it's difficult for me, for instance, to understand why anybody would like to do that. But still it is so many people are doing that. And the problem for the Excel, the company, they were very innovative, but they have not been able to capitalize these ideas. Actually, they have had big problems, especially in Middle Europe, that there's kind of erosion of the product or erosion of the brand, that these very cheap products coming, because technically it is very easy to make these products. Also that it is very uncontrollable what's happening when these consumers are making this sport lively, and certainly Excel was not part of this nudist campaign as in last summer they were in Finland. Also, this is quite clearly we can see this kind of erosion that in the 80s, almost everybody in Finland knew that in active professional skiers in their summer training, they are using these sticks. For instance, here is the famous Finnish skier Mika Myllylä at the left, who had this kind of practicing with these sticks, and it has been already in the 1930s that professional skiers have done that in the summertime. But in nowadays, the same guy is advertising this in one company leaflet about this, so it has changed. His career has at least changed quite a lot, and it's a bit related to the fact that he had problems with doping, and it's a kind of dirty story. It's important. I'm not going into details about this community of practice, but it has been very influential, the role of Finnish outdoor organization Suomen Latu and Vierumäki Sport Institute in establishing this new sport. For instance, hundreds and hundreds of people had possibility to test these sticks before buying these in Vierumäki Sport Institute, and they have in Suomen Latu they have the special kind of training system for these people who have been active in this. So I would say that even if we can say that Excel was in the kind of core of this innovation, it could not do that without Suomen Latu or Vierumäki Sport Institute. And these different institutes have a bit different ideas also. For Suomen Latu, it's natural life, socializing, joy of going outside. Excel, it's a bit different. It's commercial company, and then finally Vierumäki Sport Institute. It's more about health, fitness, sport, and all kinds of testing. And then finally, my final suggestion. It's kind of condensed all what has been saying, that Nordic walking has been kind of social movement. Technically, it was modest invention with very modest marketing budget. Excel is very small company, And interestingly, it has been elder ladies who have been entrepreneurs. They have combined, related, integrated and organized pre-existing but previously separate components in novel way. It means that they have decided where it is proper to use these sticks and what is the proper time, what are the suitable places, and in a way these entrepreneurs have made their own of their own life, made the movement and made the model to follow. And contrary to many lead user analysis, fashion, men, wealthy people came only later. And now it seems that even men are coming out from their closet and they are walking in these sticks, but not me. Thank you.
Can I shut that? Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much to Sitra and IISS for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to be here in Finland. And I think that story about the walking sticks is very interesting. I'm just going to put this here. Because actually it's partly a story about how you transform something that used to be seen as a sign of weakness, to use a walking stick, into a sign of vitality. So, and it's also a prime example, it seems to me, of why innovation is rarely about new ideas. It's actually about reusing and reinventing old ideas. And I'm pleased to say that when I first saw, actually I read Mika's paper on the rise of Nordic walking sticks before I saw a Nordic walking stick. And when I first saw one, I thought, these are completely ridiculous. Who on earth would use these? I now own 3 of them. And they're absolutely essential for going up any kind of hill. I'm not going to say very much about one of the most important issues about consumers and innovation, which I guess we might discuss this afternoon, which is whether in fact we have too much innovation. Arguably, much of innovation is about persuading us that we need to buy new things because there's something better or different. And arguably, one of the biggest challenges ahead of us is to consume less, or certainly to consume differently. And certainly if that consumption involves the production of carbon, then one of the big challenges of the future may be not to innovate more, but to reuse more. One of the features of my childhood was the appearance in our house of repairmen who would come and repair machines that we had, televisions and washing machines. These days, it seems to me, we don't repair anything anymore. When it breaks, we get something new, or maybe we put a new module into it. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I leave that on the table. I'm just going to really talk about 2 different ways of thinking about consumers and innovation, and 2 different stories. And the first is the story of consumers and innovation is changing because consumers want different kinds of experiences. And in order for companies to deliver those, companies have to find ways of incorporating consumers more into their innovation and production strategies. And so the whole relationship of mass production to mass consumption is changing into something much more intimate, more intense. And so that the notion of the value chain, which is the most ubiquitous common idea about how we organize production, is being reformed by that. So this is a change in the mode of consumption. But the second possibility is that actually the whole idea of the consumer might be outmoded, and that in important areas of the economy, thinking of people as consumers may be completely unhelpful. And actually it might be better to think of people as participants or contributors or players, but not primarily consumers. And that the way that they play a role in innovation then is quite different. It's not about incorporating them into value chains, but giving them tools and platforms in which they create things. And so I just want to talk about the difference between these two views of the world. At the core, as Richard said at the outset, is an inherited, very technocentric manufacturing view of innovation. And we have two metaphors, I think, that we commonly use to think about this. One is the value chain. And so products get created down a chain of value, and as you put in more materials or inputs or labour, more value gets created, and then the next link of the chain, and the consumer is the final link in that chain. And the second, of course, is the pipeline, and the pipeline is that knowledge gets created at this end of the pipeline, and if you make the pipeline large enough and lubricate it, and then ideas pop out as products at the other end of the pipeline, which consumers consume. And you can see embedded in these two models is a kind of account of innovation, which is essentially innovation is about special people in special places coming up with special ideas and then finding ways to adapt those to consumers. And those special people might be boffins in the lab, or designers in their studio, or artists in their garret, or what have you. Underlying this is the notion that innovation, there's usually a moment of birth when an idea is created. There's usually an inventor. It's usually a sequential and probably linear process. It usually requires, or often requires, the creation of formal and new knowledge that is then in some way parcelled up and tried to relay to consumers. And the big challenge for a lot of companies then, as Richard said in his introduction, is this gap between what the producer thinks the consumer might want and what the consumer might take up into their life. And this gap between the knowledge of the consumer's desire and how they might incorporate a product into their life and the producer's assumptions, this gap is where the risk of innovation is often created, because into it will fall failed innovations. And so one of the challenges of innovation strategy is then how do you close that gap? How do you make innovation less risky by allowing yourself to close this gap between your knowledge of what consumers want and their own perceptions of it? Now, closing that gap was difficult enough when economic conditions meant that innovation was necessary, but competition was more limited and the pace of technological change was slower. In an era where competitive advantage rapidly erodes because assets can quickly be copied, techniques can quickly spread, technology is very readily available, innovation becomes more important to establish competitive advantage, because the way in which you combine the ingredients of technology, people and other assets is what really counts. It's the mixture of intangible and tangible assets together to create distinctive blends or recipes that really counts. And so companies now find themselves not just occasionally facing this chasm with their consumers into which innovation might fall, but continually doing that. And so what you see then is companies facing this kind of chasm and trying to navigate their way through it, and devising, I think, a whole range of strategies to close it and make themselves more effective. So what you see in that kind of area, I think, is a different set of different ways in which we might talk about it. We might talk about user-centered design, so that this is a fantastic example of user-centered design. Apple is not a company that engages in lead user innovation particularly. It's got a very traditional design-led process, but it's a very user-centric design-led process of the kind made famous by companies like IDEO, heavily based on much more ethnographic and much more detailed assessments of consumer needs. So you see, I think, probably more of that. You see very rapid learning from consumers. So a very good example is Zara, the Spanish fashion retailer, in which Zara's shops, same is true of H&M, They're really interfaces between the consumer and the supply chain. That is all they are. So they are interfaces for consumers to make their impact on the supply chain as rapidly as possible. And that means that the supply chain has to be very alert, very adaptive, very intelligent. You see it in services very much. So one of the big problems of the manufacturing-dominated view of innovation is that it says very little about services innovation. UK economy, probably 80% services. What is the relevance of a pipeline view of innovation built on R&D labs to a service-led economy? So 44% of the UK economy is public sector. What's the relevance of a manufacturing-led account of innovation to the public sector, to innovation, health, welfare, prisons, what have you? Well, in services, much of innovation depends on how you incorporate the consumers into the service script. And one way of understanding services is that they operate with scripts. So the script for having a meal in a restaurant is you go to the restaurant, you order the meal is delivered to you, you eat the meal, and then you pay. And of course, self-service changes that script, because in self-service you don't have a menu, you don't book a table, you pay for the food and then you eat it and then you clear it away. So in a traditional restaurant you eat and then you pay, and in a self-service restaurant you pay and then you eat. So much of the innovation in the service sector depends on getting consumers to play a different role in the script. You can only do that often if you encourage consumers to write the script with you in some sort of new and different way. And finally, as Richard gestured in his opening, what you now see is also the development of much more open innovation models. So companies realizing that traditional pipeline models, which depend on their knowledge and their assets, actually trap them with a limited view of the world. They can quickly become closed, myopic, heavily dependent on their own expertise, and as a result they tend to reinforce past success rather than being alert to new and emerging opportunities. And so you see Procter & Gamble, for instance, trying to refashion their entire innovation strategy to be much more open, including to consumers. Eindhoven, you can go to Philips. Eindhoven, the National Physical Laboratory at Eindhoven, where the European light bulb came from, still accounts for a huge share of Philips' profits. And until recently, it had barbed wire around it. And the whole idea was that you kept people out, because this was where the boffins were, and you need to keep that knowledge separate and secret. Now they're trying to take the barbed wire down, take the security gates away, and turn it into a much more open campus. My bet is they will almost certainly fail, because the traditions and culture of engineering and inwardness are so strongly embedded. And then finally, of course, in mobile phones, this is a very good example. Nokia, head of design at Nokia, now British, of course, but I'll let that pass. Mobile phones, a lot of the history of mobile phones, increasingly in many ways, is, well, it started as very much an engineering culture. Now much more, let's follow the consumers. Let's be as alert as possible to how consumers develop and pick up products, and then let's follow them rapidly when they show and establish where the market is. So in this whole variety of ways, you can see companies deploying strategies which are much more about incorporating users into product development. And in a way, one way of thinking about consumers in this context is to think about this. What has Apple managed to do to consumers with this? What it has managed to do is to turn people into fans. If you go to the Apple store in London, Regent Street, what you see is not a shop. What you see is a kind of cathedral. And what you see is not consumers, you see pilgrims and disciples. And they are there to pay homage to the shrine of Apple. They are kind of there to imbibe the kind of Apple way. There are kind of tutorials for novices to be brought into the faith. There are kind of genius bars where people can share tips. The staff don't appear to be paid. They also appear to buy into the Apple way so much they're almost doing it as an act of enthusiasm rather than because they're employees. So what Apple has done has turned consumers into fans who kind of somehow emotionally and intellectually ascribe to the product. So more companies, I suspect, will want to create more fans. So that's one story about innovation. And what you see there is a whole set of different strategies. Zara, low-cost airlines, Apple, they're all in some sense in the same world, but they're doing things in quite different ways. They all involve rapid learning. They all involve very flexible use of resources. They all involve innovation as a much more networked kind of activity, much more porous. Moving beyond that, however, I think there's a second possibility, which is not that companies will need to incorporate consumers more into their value chains, but that consumers and the whole notion of consumption may be inappropriate. And these are areas of life. Mika has already referred to Web 2.0. I'm not sure when the web stopped being Web 0.0 and became 1.0 and then 2.0, but people talk now a lot about Web 2.0. And these are creating business models, tools, software, ways of being almost, which are much more participatory. And out of this kind of primeval stew of a much more participatory culture in which people can create content, share it, rate it, rank it, provide one another with tools to help create it, which is creating YouTube and Flickr and social media and social networking and even things like eBay and Craigslist, arguably. What you see in this is the emergence of much more highly collaborative forms of creativity, creating quite complex goods out of communities of co-creation. So you see here open source software, not just Linux, but Ubuntu, Apache and others, computer games, The Sims, World of Warcraft. There are now 8.2 million people engaged in World of Warcraft. That's more than the population of London. They on average play the game 21 hours a week. It's a $1 billion economy. Second Life, creating its own currencies. Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, 1 million articles in English, 400,000 in German, more traffic than virtually all the big media brands online in the States combined, 5 employees. So these are examples of quite structured, collaborative creativity in which it doesn't seem to me appropriate to think of the people involved just as consumers. They see themselves as players, contributors and participants. And what you see in this area is these people are creating radical, disruptive innovation, often because they are the only people prepared to innovate. So much of the Web 2.0 innovation has come from people who've solved problems for themselves. YouTube came from a couple of people wanting to share video. Flickr came from someone wanting to share photographs. Wikipedia came from virtually nowhere. Linux came from the same source. So quite a lot of radical, disruptive innovation. Also possibly quite a lot of radical innovation of exploring in use what something is capable of doing. So the whole history of the web is really an example of a cumulative social innovation of people together exploring what might be possible, as a very good book sponsored by Sitra, by Ika Tuomi, called Networks of Innovation, pointed out in 2004. So what you see here is a much more participatory kind of form of innovation. And here, the task then is not for people to incorporate themselves into innovation strategies in companies, but to create their own forms of organisation. And so, if you like, if the fan is the metaphor for consumers in the first model, in this model, the metaphor is the hacker or the pro-am, a committed but able amateur who is probably doing it for their own reasons, often in an economy which involves peer-to-peer production, gift, altruism, giving stuff away, revealing freely, not seeking intellectual property. And if you think about the organisations, if they are indeed organisations in this space, Wikipedia, open source, so on and so forth, they don't really look like organisations. They look like birds' nests. I mean, if you think about Wikipedia, Wikipedia resembles a kind of bird's nest of little pieces of information all put together to create something large. It certainly does not resemble a pipeline or a value chain. And if you look at the successful organisations, computer games I think are a very prime example. What they do is they provide people with a core which then attracts a very large number of contributors who can connect with one another and collaborate, and then they can start building something out of that. So connect, collaborate, contribute, create around a core. And so what you see in this area then is companies perhaps being at that core, but actually sustaining a much larger community of activity around them. And the point is not to sell things necessarily to people, but to give people tools that they use over and over again to then create their own stuff. So in the first model that I was talking about, open innovation is primarily conceived as an inbound process. How can we open up our innovation strategies to get a wider range of ideas into our company? In the second way of thinking about it, open innovation is a much more outbound process. How can we create a core and some tools that people will then start doing something creative with, which will create a larger community around our company? In the first way of viewing it, participation is the route to a better consumer experience, because by participating I might get more say over the production process or more say over the innovation process. In the second, consumption is the route to participation. You buy your tool or your software or your access in order to participate in a community like a game. So these are quite different ways of thinking about it. Where are we headed? Well, I think we're headed to a world in which, let me just finish here, we'll have very many different modes of consumerism, and so very many different modes of innovation. There will still be mass consumerism, in which the consumer is primarily a buyer, and the primary mode of interaction is exchange and transaction. Then there'll be mass customization, personalization, in which the consumer is more like a fan, and the relationship is more relational, more intimate. There's still consumption underneath it, but it's more relational. And then you could imagine these new forms of participatory culture emerging over the next 10, 20 years as this technology spreads and diffuses and becomes more powerful, in which the primary mode is participation and collaboration, not even relation or consumption. And each will require different approaches to engagement. This last story may affect 10 to 30% of the economy. It won't be the story of all of the economy, but it could be the story of a very important part of the developed economies. And then if you think finally about what the roots of all this consumer culture are, we have several different roots all combined. You have, if you like, ultra-capitalism, fast, flexible, global, networked, fleet of foot, rapid learning, continual redeployment of competencies across global knowledge networks, global innovation strategies. You have the kind of post-industrial Web 2.0 world in which there's a heavy emphasis on tools of collaboration, very software-dominated, very informational. Then I think in a lot of this culture you have a kind of, not a post-industrial, but an anti-industrial culture. So many of the ideas of this new consumer culture echo the ideas of the 1960s. You hear echoes of ideas of people like Ivan Illich and Schumacher, which is primarily anti-corporate and anti-industrial. And in many ways, what we're living through now with Web 2.0 are simply living out many of the dreams of the early pioneers of the personal computer in the 1960s around San Francisco. People who saw the personal computer as a route to personal liberation. And then finally, actually what we're creating are new ways to bring back to life pre-industrial forms of organisation. Wikipedia is essentially a commons, an informational commons, a familiar idea from agriculture. In YouTube and Flickr and social media, we're seeing the reinvention of a kind of folk culture. So what you're seeing is not just a rush to the future. What we're simultaneously seeing is the resuscitation of very old ideas. And that innovation will be a continual process of reviving old ideas, the pre-industrial and the anti-industrial, as well as creating the ultra-industrial and the post-industrial. And that will be where innovation and consumers will all get kind of mixed up. Thank you.
Questions after the next two comments, but first of all I'd like to hand over to Petri Peltonen to make a comment on the presentations so far. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's certainly been with a great interest that I've listened to the presentations by Richard, Mika and Charles on the user-inspired innovation. I must confess I have learned a lot. It's been certainly a very, very sort of a new, fresh approaches to the innovation policies, and also extending the concept of open innovation to my understanding, to really address the meaning and role of user to a greater extent. Because really, when I was sort of preparing my commentary here, the first question that came to my mind: what is the difference between user-inspired innovation and open innovation? We've discussed globally and also in Finland for the past a couple of years about open innovation. That's been the trend, and fair enough, I think we've been able also in Finland to build certain features of open innovation into the policies, and in particular the implementation mechanisms of innovation in Finland. But again, the open innovation concept, to my understanding, is really more to do with the openness of innovation when it's especially involving companies and universities. It's a strong company-university interaction, open, really spreading ideas and cross-fertilizing ideas. But the role of user in this classical open innovation concept, at least in Finland, has not necessarily been sufficiently recognized so far. Obviously, Finland is a well-known open source or open innovation country, starting from Linux, MySQL, which is actually one of the largest open source databases, and its roots deeply rooted in Finland. And there were several good examples put forward by Charles in particular on YouTube, Wikipedia, and the others. And it's certainly true that all global companies, including Nokia and Philips, are sort of re-engineering their innovation strategies and building open innovation very much in there. But now what's the then this user-inspired innovation? What's the new sort of approach there? And obviously it's involving the user or the consumer clearly in the center point of innovation. And I think there were great expressions made by Charles, for example, showing that at best, really, users and consumers become even fans of products, and in that sense are really deeply involved in the creation of the features and the next generation products. So I think that's clearly something where there are very positive examples set up by Nokia, for example, or Apple, to name a few. Fine. But I think then things got a little bit more complicated, at least for myself personally, when I think it was Richard who basically was saying that, okay, the latest thing is now the user-inspired innovation, but who is the user? I think that was, at least to me, a sort of a killer question, because I mean he was basically saying that in many cases the user at the same time is not only the consumer, but he or she is also the even the manufacturer or provider, at least when we go outside of the consumer product innovations to something like business-to-business innovations. So then things get really complicated. You're not only a fan or a consumer of a given gadget or service, you are basically one element in an innovation ecosystem playing several roles at the same time. So how do you actually then, create policies that at the same time support the openness of innovation for the consumers and at the same time provide the safeguards for that are needed, for example, if you're playing the role of a manufacturer. Fine, but I guess my role here is to really come up with the policymakers' views. I'm coming from the Ministry for Trade and Industry, and basically we are in a very interesting moment in Finland at this time. Actually, we have a new government agenda where innovation policy is very deeply and strongly built in, not only as a one sectorial policy, but it's very much a core element in the overall Finnish competitiveness strategy in the economic policies to start with. So in that sense, there's a lot of belief in innovation also at the level of the government, I'm happy to say. And also one of the features of the fresh new government agenda is that we're clearly moving the innovation activities from the basic science and technology-led push to a much wider and open innovation concept, where really the elements of market pull and the engagement of users are there. New instruments, including tax incentives and innovative markets, are very much the new features that will be also taken into account in the Finnish innovation policies in the coming years. One of the challenges in particular that come and we policymakers are faced with is really, in particular, the intellectual property questions, because I think those get really complicated when we are opening and extending the innovation processes to users for things like co-creation. So it's very difficult to sort of identify what are the roles of individual players there, what are their interests and their rights and obligations. I have no answers there. The only thing I'm happy to say that also as part of the government initiatives, there's going to be at best even a reform of Finnish innovation or intellectual property policies. So there's going to be at least a wide-ranging review of the present practices, and at least there are good hopes that we are at this process able to sort of extend the concept of intellectual property even better to support the user-led innovation features in Finland. And then maybe to complete my brief commentary, not only at the level of policies and theories, but I'm happy to say that there are also some concrete initiatives ongoing in the area of user-inspired innovation. In particular, there's an interesting concept called the Helsinki Living Lab, which is actually a fresh new idea kicked off earlier this year in February. It's a user-centric innovation pilot project led by Forum Virium in Helsinki, engaging Pasila and many other regions. There are about 20 organizations now in this project. It's funded by Tekes, the Finnish funding agency for technology and innovations. And in the consortium there are altogether 20 participants, 4 universities. There are major Finnish corporations, for example, Esko, a major retailer, Saunalahti, a mobile operator, and even a semi-public organization, Tieliikennelaitos. So those are connected obviously with a number of SMEs. And the idea is really to re-innovate issues like, for example, when it comes down to traffic information providing. How does that, what are the users' needs? How would they like to receive their information on traffic jams that, for example, were troubling Esko this morning? So at least there's something interesting ongoing. The Helsinki Living Lab, I think, is a very good opening, because I think it's through those pilot cases and initiatives that I think we are in the best position to outline the policies as well. It's difficult to first come up with a theory and then come up with the solutions. That's not the way. I think it's the best is if we're able to come up with interesting pilot projects, and by learning from those, then developing the mechanism and ways of formulating Finnish innovation policies. So with this, Mr. Chairman, I think this concludes my commentary. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Sirkka Heinonen to make an additional comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this invitation to comment on these inspiring presentations we just heard by Charles Leadbeater and by Mika Pantsar, and also Richard Hackett's opening words. Charles Leadbeater has pointed out that innovation involves borrowing ingredients and blending them together in new ways. And mingling is important. We should encourage people and ideas to find one another and combine creatively. Mika Pantsar reminds us that such borrowing is combined to the user's very private and own personal experience realm. In the case of Nordic walking, for example, it is the consumers who create new ways to use products in the so-called experience society. He spoke about reinventing sports with practitioners, and I'm happy to add that I belong to the powerful user group of elderly ladies who are not afraid to use sticks. I'm not an enthusiastic, but I do it every now and then. And I'd like to add, though, that user-inspired innovation is also linked to self-expression and search for meaningful life. In other words, users are motivated to innovate if the innovation process matches or adds to their feelings of self-expression. We have a project at VTT on social media in the crossroads of physical, digital and virtual worlds, where user-generated contents play a crucial role. This is exactly concerned with the social movement view that Mika Pantsar mentioned in his presentation, and Charles Leadbeater also discussed the social media concept as a kind of new user culture. So the search for collaborative creativity is increasingly done by combining digital and physical spaces. And bearing this combination in mind, I wish to raise two main points in my comment. The first point is the importance of broad user innovation participation, openness and consideration of views from very different user groups. The second point is the need for constructing creative foresight spaces as combination of physical and digital spaces to stimulate innovations. And I see innovation much as social construction that is fueled by human curiosity and fed by technology. But this first point of this importance of broad user innovation participation, Charles Leadbeater in his writings has called for innovation as a national narrative. A national narrative is a collective story which can also be told by the mouth of individual citizens. People as users of technology want to write the story themselves. This is essential for user inspiration. And this brings to my mind a call for national innovation campaigns. We can arrange idea generation campaigns where citizens as users take part from all walks of life. representing a much wider cross-section of society. In fact, quite recently, last year, several universities, together with VTT, organized a so-called idea movement, where ordinary people, not designers or manufacturers, these ordinary people were asked to produce new ideas for mobile communications to facilitate daily life. And actually more than 37,000 user-inspired innovations or ideas were received. Then to my second point, Charles Leadbeater says that today more people have more time and capacity to be creative than ever before. According to him, modern innovation policy should be focused on mobilizing the power of user innovators. He has asked what kind of spaces can we provide for lead users to prototype and test their innovations. As an answer to his question, I strongly suggest mobilizing the creative mass power in combining physical and digital spaces. This is a natural approach to the MySpace and YouTube generation. Creative foresight space could be installed in schools, in workplaces, in libraries, at home, in other public spaces. This would help build up a society of mass creativity in an ongoing innovation dialogue between users and producers. As an example of participatory Web 2.0 application, I'd like to mention that last month we launched an open web laboratory in our Summit project. It's like a bird's nest, Charles Leadbeater mentioned. It is a meeting point, virtual and physical meeting point, inviting users, designers and researchers to discuss new ideas and test them. So you are also everybody invited to visit that open web laboratory. To conclude my comment, I'd like to say that the huge potential of citizen creativity, user creativity, must not be overlooked. Providing creative foresight spaces might be one solution for bringing out that potential. Thank you for your presentations and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sitra. We'll now open to questions and comments from the floor. Two observations just listening to the presentations myself. One is, which was implicit in all of them, I think, was the importance of, if users are going to be engaged in innovation, in communities of users. It seems that communities of users are vastly more powerful than individual users on their own. So interesting policy implications there for how that might be stimulated. And the second thing about where we can expect user-led innovation to take place, there's a question around what I call the skills delta. Okay, so you can see this in open source innovation because the programmers who are the users of the tools also have the skills to be the manufacturer of the programs. That's perhaps different when Charles was pointing at the iPod, for instance. We're all users, but I couldn't make one, and it's a long way from my experience of being able to make one. So I think there's some gap there in the way in which, where we can expect different types of user interaction with technologies. And the question really remains, which is, we have a new story around innovation here, and it's very compelling, and the question remains, where is the problem? Maybe this is just a commentary that we can all look at and sort of say, well, that's a different way of understanding, and we feel more advanced now. But is there a problem, and if so, what is it, and how do we solve it, is really the question when we confront the questions of user-inspired innovation. So with that, and give the panellists a bit of time to mull over that question, I'll also open to a couple of comments from the floor, and then we'll return to the panellists to respond to those. Does anyone have a question? We have one at the back over there.
Hello, my name is Risto Penttilä, and I have a question concerning the public policy implications of what we've heard. Now, we've seen that people are out there doing all sorts of creative things, and it seems that we are in search for public policy to do something useful too for these people. Now, would you go as far as saying that in addition to Web 2.0, we are looking at welfare state 2.0. What are the public policy implications of the things we've heard? Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. And question from Esko.
One short comment. You have forgotten the role of the public sector as a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
Roughly 16% of EU member countries. All right, I have to do this. Like one Finnish commentator said, that this is the way how to raise the value of my information. But I was my comment was on the role of the public sector, because roughly 16% of the total GDP of the European Union member countries is devoted for public procurement. That plays a major role in innovation. What are your comments on that?
So thank you. Well, we'll take those two and then reopen for others. So if I can turn first to you, Charles, if you could.
They're closely connected, of course, these comments. I've just written a paper called, what's it called? The User-Generated State. And the idea is, well, if, very crudely, even more crudely than everything else I've said, but very crudely, if you have a computer game with 1 million players, you get 1% of them to be player developers. That's 10,000 people working for free. So if you could get 1% of the children in secondary school to be peer-to-peer teachers, or 1% of the patients of the NHS, what would that do to the productivity of the system? Because we won't be able to keep pace with rising demand for personalised healthcare with an industrial era production system. It's simply incapable of meeting that. So more and more, I suspect, we're going to need to imagine how we co-create public goods by giving people, in part, tools and communities and expertise and resources to do that, rather than imagining the state will deliver solutions to them. So the state, I think, can create platforms and tools for that to happen. And again, this is not new. This is actually very old. If you look at systems for cleanliness and sewerage, or the most interesting, I think, is the postal system. The postal system succeeds by giving people a very simple tool, the stamp. And actually it's a kind of platform for a lot of self-activity then. So I think there's a huge read across to how you make public systems more productive, and that then comes partly to this question about public procurement, because actually the public sector should be a key place where you create these communities of user engagement, and particularly public media, I think, plays a really important role. So the future of the BBC, I think, in our country is very, very important to whether you can create some of these spaces, but also how you imagine the future of education systems and so on and so forth. So I think this is again one of the big stories, is that part of the traditional story of innovation focuses on lone profit-seeking inventors, and actually the real story of innovation is often that it's public and private. And that public investment in infrastructure and tools is vital to then successive private investment. Final point about the iPod and your claim that, of course, you'll be incapable of making one, because I think we still don't know how far all this might go, because actually there's quite a lot of this which is really open sourceable. The MP3 file was an open standard. Which they have incorporated. Apple has very cleverly encased this in all sorts of IP, but actually in theory much of the design of this is open sourceable, so there is quite an interesting discussion going on about the future of open source manufacturing, which is, could you imagine some public library of components and goods that people could draw down upon and then either make products themselves with new kinds of machine tools, or get them made simply through supply chains in China. So I think it's wrong to assume that the manufacturing economy isn't susceptible to some of these open source developments.
First of all, consumer market, I have been research or doing research with one telephone company, Finnish telephone company, and still in the 70s and 80s it was very much problem if there was any kind of creativity of consumers, because they destroyed valuable kind of technology, and it was really much opposed. So it was 100 years where telephone companies in a way think that how consumers should learn to behave with technology. But now it seems that they have changing their way of thinking, and now they are emphasizing how they should make technology which learn from consumers. So it's really this kind of thinking patterns are changing, and it was very much related in that company that they noticed that, for instance, it's third generation mobile phone services, nobody are willing to buy these services, and then they recognized that maybe they should understand what's happening actually in the ordinary life of people, and how this company could help people to innovate in their life, and not how these people help this company to innovate. So these questions are quite different. And then about the public sector, I think Microsoft have learned in last 10 years quite clearly, when they have been active in public schools, that in the beginning they started to say, they said that in future that there is no teachers anymore, that teachers are replaced by the computers. But that was not working well, and it's understandable that teachers were very much opposing that idea. And then they started to think that maybe it's books that are replaced by computers. And now they have noticed that it was not books that are going away, but actually they should understand what's actually happening in the learning process. So now they are very much involved in research about learning and thinking in a kind of dialogue between this learning, people learning, and also teachers. And I think that this is kind of stages which are taking place, and also I think that pilots in public sector, they are very important. We can experiment with these things and find out that these for instance educators, they are not only receiving but they are active doers, and I think that this kind of idea about doers also in public sector is very important.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Just one comment on procurement, of course, is that it is crucial, because in the public sector that is a classic area where you have manufacturer, supplier and user in the same place. And quite often, with particularly the outsourcing of increased procurement of public services to the third sector and to the private sector, you have a lot of the public sector moving from essentially a manufacturer and supplier to a user and a consumer in that point, which makes it quite difficult. A couple of points on it, of course. One is that you don't always want innovation in public services. Nuclear power safety, traffic light systems, these are things that you don't want to innovate in very often. And the other question is, when you're actually looking at public money, you deal with additional problems of accountability, which are quite often in tension with innovation. So where does it happen, when does it happen, how do you bound it, become increasingly important in sort of public procurement questions, yeah.
I'm impressed about morning's speech, but I would like to make. I'm from a non-English speaking country, so that's my question is back to basic. There's very similar words: innovations, revolutions, evolutions. What's you are making some difference? Because definition is very important, and back to the knowledge convergence of knowledge. Unless it's very difficult to if people are speaking differently and the other speaking differently. So again, my question is, what's your meaning of innovations, and what's the difference of revolutions and evolutions?
Thank you. We'll take a couple more and then return to the panel. Yeah. Thank you.
Ralph Ekebom from the Finnish Ministry of Social Affairs. I would like to come back to the comment that Mr. Peter Peltonen made concerning intellectual property rights. In a new era of user-inspired innovation, how do you see that we need to reform, or is there need to reform the system for intellectual property rights? And how can these user-inspired innovations live and thrive in a world where we have these difficulties of IPRs? Thank you.
Okay, I'll turn to the panel. Mika, if you would like to respond.
First of all, about the evolution and innovation, all these terminology, there's quite a lot books about how evolutionary economics, how they define innovation, all these things. But I think that's still what Joseph Schumpeter said about innovation, that it's always integration. It's very good definition, and it's also what evolution actually, it's always the smaller bits coming to larger and larger, and it's coming down to up. This is, as I see, evolution. So this is I think that Schumpeter is still very, very, very good. For this question about IPR, I don't have any good answer, but as an author of books, I would like to see good protection of copyrights.
Well, as far as innovation goes, I think it's often finding new solutions, but often to quite old questions, and often involving quite old ingredients, maybe with some new ones. But the mistake, I think, with innovation is that people think it's invention. It's about the creation of new knowledge. And actually, most innovation, in my experience, is about the recombination of existing knowledge. And that can either be a kind of evolutionary I think an evolutionary understanding of innovation is often extremely helpful, but it can also be a kind of managed or designed process of evolution. As far as intellectual property goes, the most important thing is for policymakers not to pass laws which entrench incumbent business models. That would be the single most important thing. So not to treat historically contingent business models as somehow the natural order. So I would be against extensions of copyright, deepening or making it easier for people to claim patents on things that aren't patentable. I would be against patents on very basic kinds of technology, which I think it's important are shared. So I think that the most important thing is that that story I told at the start about this model of traditional innovation, if you take that too far, what you end up with is a kind of a system of innovation in which all property is held by someone, you have to trade it, collaboration becomes increasingly difficult. So that's the first thing. Don't do things which entrench existing models too deeply. And the second is be open to forms of innovation like open source, Creative Commons, copyleft, and different business models. So, IBM makes shed loads of money, absolutely shed loads of money, but the way it makes it is completely different from 10 years ago. And the idea that open source is anti-commercial is completely wrong. It just means you make money in a different way. So there are all sorts of business models which are compatible with open forms of intellectual property, but they just happen to be different. So the really important thing is avoid IP fundamentalism. Avoid taking a fundamentalist position, which I'm afraid too many people in the States are doing.
Okay, now, despite being about user-led innovation, this is a supplier-led session with us on the stage and you down there. There's a bit of an information problem there, so I've got two times here. One says we have 5 minutes left and one says time is up. So I don't know whether you want to carry on or not, but what I'm going to do is stick with the time is up one, unfortunately, because I know that everyone probably wants coffee as well. However, I'd like to say thank you very much to Mika, to Charles, to Petri and to Sirka, and to you for your questions and for your attention this morning. I found it a fascinating session. Thank you very much and see you later on.